start the... I know when I started John, I was like, yeah, I've read this before, it'll be fine. And about 3 chapters in, I was like, I wonder if it's too late to change my mind and teach Philippians or something. Yeah. All right, so let's look at John chapter 6. I'm just going to read verses 1 to 21. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Okay, so chapter 5, last week, took place in Jerusalem at one of the Jewish festivals. So now chapter 6 opens sometime later. What's the situation in verses 1 to 4?
We had a great crowd of people following him.
Mm-hmm. Why?
Because they had seen how he was healing the sick and what he was doing in the town, and they were...
Yeah, they'd seen the miracles, and so this big crowd of people are around him, and so he goes to the other side, the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, and all these people follow him. And what does John add in verse 4?
It's Passover. And close to the Passover.
Yeah, now why in the world would John throw that in right here? This is a little hint of what's most important in the chapter. It's not the chronology as much as it is the theology. That mention of the Passover is important because...
Of the unleavened bread?
Yeah, to start. Yep, the unleavened bread plus a whole lot of other things that are going to be connected back to the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is really the theological basis underneath everything that happens in John 6. So all those connections with the Passover and, well, let's just talk about it for a minute. Exodus is this lengthy, in-depth look at the beginning of God's covenant relationship with Israel. Tell me, just in general, what were the big things that were important in the Passover?
That you mark above your door with blood from the lamb, and then he would pass over and knock. It was killing the firstborn from the entire, the entire Jerusalem.
Right. Well, it was in Egypt, yeah.
Egypt.
But yeah,
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. So there's the Passover lamb who substitutes for the firstborn, and that turns away the judgment of God from the people. There's the unleavened bread, which they eat as they're leaving Egypt. Then when they get out in the wilderness, how do things go?
Not well.
Not well. You'd think after you see all the miracles in Egypt, the people would be like, "Oh, we are on, God has got it under control." But what happened?
They crumble, they complain.
They do.
The food, they don't have, I was thinking it's funny that cucumbers are mentioned.
And And garlic, yeah.
Onions,
Yeah.
He's like, the kill numbers, we just.
Well, I just thought of that, Sherry. I thought, well, if it was the Antolis, they'd be like, we can't do without garlic. So, yeah, they're out in the wilderness and they're wandering around and there's no food. And so they start to grumble. And what does God do? He provides bread from heaven. That whole idea of God pouring out bread from heaven is really important for what's going to happen in this chapter. Because Jesus is going to use that whole picture of bread to point to himself. So John 6 tells us, really, the whole book of Exodus is ultimately about Jesus. All that stuff that was going on with the Passover, the wandering in the wilderness, there's also water from the rock, which is going to be important in chapter 8, or in chapter 7. Like, all of that stuff is ultimately about Jesus. So, the significance of the things he's going to do and say in this chapter are rooted in just huge events in the history of Israel that happened in Exodus. Okay, so we'll come back to some of that. Now, when Jesus sees the crowd, this big crowd of people, what does he say to Philip?
Where shall we buy bread for all these many people?
Yeah. And we know from what he says later, there are 5,000 men, and the word is specific men, which I think indicates there were probably a lot more than that because we know there were children there too, probably women as well. So, you're talking about a crowd of people, at least 10,000, probably more than that. So it's an enormous crowd of people. And when he says to Philip, where are we going to buy bread for all these people to eat? Why is he doing that? Is he stumped?
He's tested him.
Why? Okay, what do you think he's testing him about?
If he can provide it. I mean, I think he's I think in his mind, it's like, we can do this. So there's not confident. He's not at that place where, no big deal, you got this, guy.
Well, that's the thing. So think about the things that the disciples have seen Jesus do up to this point. What should their response have been?
What are you going to do?
You got it.
You going to raise
Right?
manna?
That's right. like Jesus has so many ways to sort out this problem if he wants to, and they've seen him do miraculous things where they should be looking at this situation and saying, I don't know, Lord, where we're going to get bread. I have no idea, but you know. So, what should we do? But what does he say instead?
How much it would cost to buy.
Yeah. Yeah, his answer is it would take, 200 denarii is, a denarius is basically the same as a day wage for a day worker. And so it's the equivalent to like 8 months' wages. And Philip was like, that's how it would take an enormous amount of money, not just to feed the people, but did you notice he said just for each person to get a bite? Like not even to fully feed them, but just a little bit.
Taste.
It would take so much money to feed all of those people. He's occupied with the magnitude of the problem, and it's like he's forgotten who he's talking to. But we don't do that, right? We don't ever forget who we're talking to.
I wish I could say that, because there have been times, there are actually times of recognition, like, how are you going to work this out? This is going to be interesting. But that's too few and far between.
Yeah. I had a friend say to me once, she said, why is it that we're so surprised when God answers prayer? I was like, I don't know, but that's a good question. Well, it's that we're like the disciples, aren't we? God can do something amazing today, and tomorrow we can get up and think, I don't know if he's going to come through today. I don't know if he can handle this one. Because our focus is on the magnitude of the problem, not on who we're talking to. But he can totally handle this.
Can I give you an experience?
Yes. I'm glad you're back, Liz. Yeah.
And this, it's just, every time I read this chapter, it just brings that image back to me. My dad was diagnosed with cancer, and during his last month or so, they brought his hospital bed to the house. And so on Sundays, I wasn't here, but my sister and my brothers were, and on Sundays, they would go and have a meal with him on Sunday because everybody could get together that day. So one of my brothers was in church, and after church, he made an announcement to the whole church. My dad was very popular among the Native Americans on the reservation there, because we lived right in the middle of it. And he got up and he made his announcement she said, and you would not believe it, she said, people were coming and going all morning. And every person that came in had a full plate. She said it was just amazing. She says, nobody left hungry, and they all got visited back. It was just such a neat story, and I just wish that I had been there to see it, because it was just amazing to me. And so to come and think about this, and I told my sister, well, you know, Jesus fed the multitude. I said, so we shouldn't be surprised. You know, and it was just amazing to me. And, yeah, it's just a neat thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think this also passage reminds me of when Christ says, have a childlike faith. I think that's because it's funny, like, my kids will come and ask something, and I'd be like, why would you think I can do that? But no problem, they're just like, hey mom, can you do this? It's like, what was? If you understood the magnitude of what you're asking to get done and the rest of it, but they're like, oh, you know, you did this and this before, so of course, they just assume something can happen, and they have no problem just asking for that. Versus like, an adult comes, if my mom asks, she's like, okay, well, I know you're really busy, but this, if it could, or I don't know if you can, but if, and I think we come like that as an adult to Christ. It's like, okay, well, I see the magnitude of the problem. I see the magnitude of 5,000 people in food, and I get the logistics of it. And as the child, like, they don't see those problems. They just see who they're asking and know that that loving care provider gets things done for them. And I think that's hits me as what he means when he tells us to come with a childlike heart.
I love that, Amy. Like, you just have totally encompassed the faith that it takes to believe in the miracles. And because it is a child, look at, they believe the superheroes, no problem. Batman flies, you know, and that's what Jesus is he's a supernatural miracle worker that defies all logic that adults have. And children have, I mean, they have no problem with anything like that. I mean, boom, 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 it all just happens, and it is a childlike faith that we have, you know, that it's, and I just always, I always think about that in regards to that it takes that childlike faith to enter and to really accept and believe, and it's just such a powerful thing.
To come to Jesus with the assumption there are no limits is not naturally what we do. We know there are no limits, but you always come with the assumption that there must be limits, and so ask the little stuff and then you won't get disappointed. But isn't there some kind of honor that's given to Jesus when we come with really big things that nobody else can do? Because of the confidence we have that he is capable of something nobody else is. Not that, yeah.
And I think a lot of times too, it's we have that lack of faith sometimes because we've had the experience of seeing failures, you know, things not happening the way we would like them to happen. And then when they do happen, we have to take a step back and ask for forgiveness for not having that faith in me. You know, it's just one of those things that,
Yeah.
you know, it's.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, now, in the middle of all this, Andrew speaks up. What does he say?
There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?
It doesn't really help, does it? Although the combination is 7, which is always interesting when you see that number in Scripture, that you think something's going to happen right here. So he's got, these 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, and it, I mean, all of it just helps to emphasize this is a measly bit of food that's hopelessly inadequate. Barley bread was what was eaten by poor people. So, this is a little boy from a poor family anyway. But at the very least, Jesus is a prophet with miraculous power. And in that case, the mention of barley bread is actually very interesting because there is precedent for this in the Old Testament. This kind of miracle shows up in 2 Kings 4 with Elisha. There was a man who brought barley bread to Elisha, and he brought a certain number of loaves, and it was in the middle of a famine. And Elisha took that bread and it was multiplied to feed 100 people. So it's not as if this kind of thing has no precedent. And when you see the barley bread, if you know the Old Testament, you're kind of thinking, maybe something's going to happen right here. But the disciples are still just very much focused on, this is all the food we have, and look at all these thousands of people. There's no way that this is going to make any difference. So what does Jesus do next?
He says, everyone sit down.
Mm-hmm. And
Get ready.
there's plenty of grass. Does your translation say something like that?
Yes.
That's such an interesting tidbit that John adds, and I think, why did he add that? Well, maybe because that's the kind of detail you remember if you're an eyewitness. You know, that you were there and you saw it, and you're in a wilderness area, you notice there's grass. It also makes me think of Psalm 23. I don't know if it's supposed to, but it does. This idea of a shepherd who's about to feed all of his people, and here they are just sitting down on the grass. I don't know. But anyway, he tells them to sit down, and then what?
His disciples distributed the bread and there was plenty.
He took the loaves and gave thanks.
Yeah, you notice he didn't take the loaves and say, Father.
Please make these into.
Nope.
No.
He just gives thanks, and then he just starts passing it out. Yep. And he does the same with the fish. And how much do they eat? Everyone gets a morsel.
Plenty and leftovers.
Yeah, so you know everybody was full if there's leftovers. Everybody got more than enough to eat.
That's what's amazing, just with a bite.
Yeah, when everyone's full and they've all had plenty to eat, how much is left? 12 baskets. Why does that matter? That's a really specific number of baskets left over.
Because it's showing the detail, like the actuality of it. That
Yeah.
there was plenty and that there remains. It's almost like a mathematical, grandiose proof. The proof.
That
the
it's not
evidence.
just general, and there were some leftovers. But when you say there's 12, yeah, it's a very specific detail that, yeah.
Well, and
And-
disciples as well as tribes.
Yeah, and I think there were actually 12 disciples because of the 12 tribes.
Yeah.
So the fact that there's 12 tribes in Israel, you just get this picture of the covenant God feeding the covenant people. And there's just a little reminder of who he is and what he's doing for his people when you get this allusion to the 12 tribes of Israel in the number of baskets that are left over. It's just very specific, very interesting. And, you know, there's more leftovers than there was food to start with. But isn't that just the way the provision of God is? That he just pours it out. He's not stingy with his provision. If he decides that he's going to provide for these people, he's going to provide. And he just pours it out. I always wonder what they did with the leftovers. I don't know. But anyway. Now, yeah. What's your impression of that miracle? What stands out or gets your attention?
Well, it's like what you said, the distinction between this and what happens in 2 Kings. So Elijah is saying, this is happening because the Lord said it would. And here, Jesus just says, and it happens. So it just distinguishes that he's actually the creator of all things, and so he has complete authority over all of creation.
Yep.
To make whatever he needs to make happen. And so he's not appealing to anyone outside of himself
Right.
to make this miracle happen.
That's right. And we see that over and over and over in John.
Right.
And it just reinforces every time he is not another prophet. He is God in the flesh who he can speak reality into being. Sometimes he doesn't even speak it. He can just think it. He can do it because he is the Word. If he's the Word who took part in creation back in Genesis, he has no problem providing anything he wants right here. And he doesn't need anyone's permission. He doesn't have to call on a higher power because he is the higher power. He just has an authority that none of the prophets before him had.
Can I ask a question?
Mhm.
So when the Jewish nation was looking for the Messiah, did they believe that he would be the Son of God, as in like one with God?
They didn't believe he would be divine.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
They missed that, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, you look at some of the prophecies of the Old Testament about the Messiah, the kinds of things that he does.
He would be like political leader.
But that's what they were
That's what
looking
they
for.
were looking
Yes,
for.
but the prophecies, for example, in Isaiah, leave you with this impression. He's not just another, yeah.
Okay.
He is something, he's in a different category, but they were not looking for God in the flesh.
And they're not looking for that now either.
No.
What always gets me is the sheer numbers of it. That we're not talking about a small group, you know, in a church somewhere. 5,000 people more with the children. That's more than the size of all the people in Lander. This entire town following him because of his greatness, and that they knew that he was a miracle worker. And so you picture those kind of numbers. That just always boggles me, is trying to wrap my mind around the numbers and how they all sat and what that would look like. And the volume of it, because here he was the savior, and people knew that. They were definitely knew that. And so they would follow him anywhere along, and wherever he would go. And oh gosh, just like how that would look, and how
How many people crossed the Red Sea? How many Jews left Egypt?
mhm.
We're talking 1 million?
It's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
And then to feed
Yeah.
all those people.
Well, what city around us has 1 million people in it?
Yeah.
This is Wyoming.
Denver.
Denver.
In the entire state. I've been here a while, I'm well aware. We went through that. Think of all the people in Salt Lake City leaving and crossing the desert and the Red Sea, and
Coming through Parley's Canyon.
I'm with you. I'm just adding on. The Bible is full
Well,
of
it's
that.
just like too, when John the Baptist was baptizing, there were 5,000 saved at the time. You know, he was just baptizing big numbers, even as, adding to this. So, yeah, there was a lot of people.
And this isn't being done in a corner.
No.
The stuff that Jesus is doing it's very public.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every time I think of this too is when you gave us the description of being in Jeffrey City with all these people sitting out there and the 3 men standing. You know,
Oh, yeah, with
didn't
Daniel.
wanna- Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Mary.
So it's-
Well, something's kind of tugging at me, because the insight that Barley represented, that this was a poor child, and this is not gourmet bread, this is, and it just struck me that he is sufficient. I could have a used truck, but what I really want is a new Lexus. And what I need is a used truck. And God, and I'm not saying this well, but he provided what they needed. And I get in trouble when it's like, if I come with demands instead of, as our grandsons are learning, that's a want, not a need. And I just love the fact that he used, that's how he came. And people didn't recognize him as being sufficient. He didn't come right up to them.
Nobody asked him, he saw the need,
Yeah.
and he had, lavish generosity.
Yeah. Well, and thinking about Moses, when the people are wandering in the wilderness and they have no food, Moses basically does what Elisha does. He looks to God, who provided bread from heaven. Jesus doesn't look to God. He is the God who provides. He's in a totally different category from Moses. That means the God who rescued the people out of Egypt, the God who led them through the wilderness, the God who provided them with miraculous food and water for 40 years. That's the God who's standing there. When he feeds all of these people, he's not a divine instrument of power. He's the God of Moses. And this connection to the Passover, what he's going to get to next week is that he's not just the source of the bread, he is the bread. All of this is a picture of a bigger spiritual reality that Jesus is setting up for the people to understand better who he is. Because God's provision for the people isn't ultimately about food. It's ultimately about Jesus himself and the gift of eternal life, which is where all of this is headed in the next section. And, just thinking about application, it always strikes me when I read this miracle how Jesus emphasizes the inadequacy of the disciples' resources before he pours out this lavish provision. It's not just a demonstration of his power and authority, it's a reminder that where they are inadequate, he is not. And doesn't he do that for us too? Doesn't he sometimes put us on the spot so that we see our inadequacy before he then turns around and provides for us what we can't? It's just this constant reminder to the disciples, remember who he is and depend on him. And they're going to need to see this lesson over and over and over, well, just like we need to see it over and over.
Yeah, just that we can't do anything. Well, some things we can do, but they're so minor, they're so little what we can do. And if we really want to do anything great, it's through him working in us. And not our will, but like giving ourselves to be a vessel, to be instruments, to give ourselves, our lives over to him to work through us is like our purpose. And and then we can, and knowing that, like going into something, for instance, I'll just share what I've actually been thinking about that very thing this morning, and that I'm leaving at 2:30 tomorrow morning. In the morning, I'm getting up at 2 o'clock tonight or tomorrow morning to go to Jackson to shoot an elk, hopefully. And I'm just like, God, please, like I cannot do this by myself. Like, it's your will that you're the creator of all things. You will, it's up to you to make it snow, to bring them down. Like, I can do everything I possibly can, and there won't be there. It is all you. And, like, please, even, like, actually shooting it, like, help me, guide me, make me calm, because, like, thinking about it, I just get nervous, and if I see an elk, I'm just gonna go, oh my gosh, finally there's one. I'm gonna, like, just completely blow it, because I'm so excited to actually see one. So I'm like, I need help. Like, seriously help, and that it's only you and me that I can do this, and I can't do anything on my own.
Yeah, and it's a theme that's going to come back over and over in John. I mean, even you think about the very famous bit about the vine and the branches. It's just always this reinforcement that we are inadequate, but it doesn't matter because we have a God who's way more than adequate. So it's not about us pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's about us depending on the God who has it all under control.
Yeah.
And,
Go
sorry,
ahead, Amy. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, what I think that is like, and it makes me hit, especially the women's literature self-help age, especially towards women in their 30s and 40s right now is all, you're enough, you have this, believe in yourself, you got it, you're enough, like, you're enough, you're enough. You see that all the time on the little motivational signs and stuff. And I think Satan very deliberately uses that because you are not enough. But Satan doesn't want us to realize and be okay with, I'm not enough. I'm not a good mom on my own. I am not a good wife on my own. I cannot do any of this on my own. I can't be a good friend on my own. Like, any of that. But Satan wants us to think if we just do it on our own, we're good. We're good enough. We can do it. And it's a subtle way of, you don't need Christ. And instead of celebrating, no, I'm not enough.
Isn't it exhausting
Yes.
if you have to be enough? And deep down, you know you're not.
Exactly.
You know that you're not, and it's just exhausting to try to
But
act like you are.
It's what's filling our,
Yeah, that's our culture, absolutely.
yeah. And with the bread of life, just really quick, because I was talking with another believing friend the other day, she said, I find it so ironic that right now so many people are gluten intolerant, or claim gluten intolerance. She's like, isn't that odd when Christ is the bread of life? And I want to say, yeah, we really are gluten intolerant. To my unbelieving friends, you just don't really realize how gluten intolerant you are. You don't realize
miracle is actually the only one that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. Because it's really important. And it's really important because of that whole idea that Jesus is the bread of life, which we'll continue with in the next 2 weeks. But it's a very significant miracle. And the connections to the Passover, the bread, and the fact that it's the God of Moses who's doing all of this among the people is really important. So, yeah. Okay, now, what's the result of the miracle in 14 and 15?
They want to take and make him king.
They do.
By force.
That's right. Why do you think they want to make him, well, let me ask you this. What kind of king do you think they want?
They want him to defeat the Romans, it says in my Bible,
Mm-hmm.
because they think he's sufficient to do it.
Yep.
And so he could have, it talks about how he could have turned that into his own glory, like
Yep.
all of our politicians in today's world do. He really could have set the tone there and been king and been high on his mark.
Yep.
But he runs off into the mountains and prays.
Yep.
And it says, what a lesson to us today.
Yep.
To not exalt ourselves, but to be humble.
Yeah. It's significant, again, that the Passover is coming because the Passover also commemorated the victory over Egypt. That there was this leader who rescued the people from bondage. And there's a lot of nationalistic overtones that come with Passover in looking for a Messiah who's going to deliver the people from the oppression of Rome. That's what they want. And so here's Jesus with a whole group of people. We know there are at least 5,000 men. That's a pretty good start to a fighting force. If you want to rally all the troops and say, let's overthrow Rome, this is the time and the place to do it. And having done what he just did, there's no doubt he could have gotten all of these people to follow him. Well, they're already beyond following him. They want to forcibly make him king. That's absolutely what they want, is they think they've got the Messiah, and he's going to overthrow Caesar, and they want to just get on with it. And that is totally not the agenda of Jesus.
I love what Lisa said because it's about him not accepting their agenda.
Yep.
So, because I was like, how do you make somebody be king? No matter what you said to me, you couldn't make me be king unless I want the glory of that. And then I might give it a shot.
Yep.
And that wasn't his.
This reminds me, my grandfather was a minister, and I interviewed him. He lived to be 99, and shortly before he died, he told me, I interviewed him and recorded it. And he said that he was always perfect, like didn't sin a lot, didn't drink, was a minister. So he was kind of a pure vessel. And so some members of their local Democratic Party wanted him, he was not a Democrat, but they came to him and wanted him to run in an election as like a city councilman or something, or mayor or something. I can't remember what he said. But he thought about it, and he's like, yeah, I think I will run for the mayor or whatever city council that these men came to him. And so when he ran then, he was getting ready to run, they met with him and they said, now, we want you to do this and this and this. And it was all unlawful things, like they were gonna use him to be the perfect man so that he could swing in people to make them think, but then they were gonna use him, and so he said, then he had to back out of it, but it was interesting that they did that to my grandfather, and we're gonna really utilize him because he was a minister.
Wow.
Yeah. And they say in 14, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. That's a reference back to Deuteronomy 18, where Moses had said that God would raise up a prophet like him who would lead the people and proclaim God's word to them. They're not wrong in that assessment. Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy. But his agenda and theirs are very, very different. And if he does what they want him to do, he can't do what the Father wants him to do. There's a choice here between their will and the Father's will. And their will's a lot easier because there's glory and victory that direction, and there's suffering and the cross the other direction. And we don't get it so much in John, but if you read in Mark, the times when Jesus goes by himself to pray, those times always coincide with some kind of surge in popularity. where there is a temptation for him to turn away from the path of the cross and to go straight to glory. And it happens several times in Mark where it's like he could ride the popularity and do anything he wants right here with these people, because at the moment they love him. But he always steps aside and prays because he's about his Father's will, not the will of the people. This would be the easy way out, is to just become the king. And he's got all of the cosmos at his disposal to become the king if that's what he wants. But that stands in the way of going to the cross. Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about why he goes up a lot? It seems like he goes to mountains to talk to God, to pray, to like sort of escape some of these scenarios. And Moses, obviously going to Mount Sinai for the Ten Commandments. And is there any thinking about maybe why he does that, or how that might apply to us today?
Well, part of it's just to be by himself. So it's a place that's more isolated, where you won't get as many people. I mean, if you get higher up, there's all kinds of people who aren't going to follow you if you're hiking, In the Old Testament, all over the Old Testament, and in a few parts of the New Testament, there are theologically significant things that happen on mountains.
Right.
That happens multiple times.
And in the New Testament too, right?
Yeah,
When
like the
Christ is
Transfiguration
glorified.
and
Right,
stuff, yeah.
Right.
I don't know that there's anything there that's prescriptive for us, as far as an example for us to follow. But it is sort of a theme all over the scripture that significant things tend to happen on mountains, and that's understandable to a lot of the people of that time, because they expected kind of theologically heavy things to happen on mountains, because they associated that in a religious sense with God. Even people who were pagans did.
Right.
Yeah.
And spiritually, we talk about mountain highs. And
Yeah.
we attend a conference, and that was a mountain high for me, or whatever. It was something that the Lord really impressed on me.
Or even valleys, like,
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
concept of valleys, and being on top.
Yeah.
It's kind of a great description for life, a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Although I had some friends in Tanzania who lived in the mountains. Their village, this people group lived in the mountains, and I said to them, I didn't know where they lived when I first met them, and I said, where's your home area? And one of the guys said, up in the mountains, close to God. It's like, okay,
That's-
I think there is a New Age belief though
Yeah.
that mountains have that spiritual power.
well, and they built, ziggurat. That's why people built ziggurats and pyramids, was because that there was this idea that you could get up to God. The Tower of Babel
Right.
is basically a man-made mountain, because there's this idea that you can go up to God.
Well, and Jesus says, you're gonna worship me in spirit and truth, not on this mountain and not in Jerusalem.
Right.
It's not, I mean, so he very clearly says it.
Yeah. And the mountain becomes the point of worship. There's a
Right.
problem.
Yeah, right, behind the point of worship, okay.
When you say that, there was I read, I can't remember which devotional thing it came through, and I don't know how accurate it is, so, but it was, they went and they did a study, and they said most often in the Bible, when you find somebody going to the mountain to pray, withdrawing to pray, it's a man. Almost every biblical passage they went through was a men. And then with the women, they were almost always in their home duties, or when Christ comes, or when God comes to them, like Martha and Mary, they're at home serving. And she was like, I don't know if I'm making a connection, but that might be some of the male-female difference for the man to go and really focus, and for the women that be multitasking. Not that we don't need to and focus on God, but they can kind of meet you where you are. And it was a very, I wish I could find it, because it was really interesting, just, this is where the women are, and often you'll see this for men going here, and not that women can't, but you don't really ever see biblical passages where the women go off alone to.
Yeah. Interesting. That's interesting.
All right, so in order to escape the crowd, Jesus withdraws to the mountain to pray, and we know from what comes next, and from the account in Mark, that he sends the disciples on without him. I suspect the disciples are not immune to this messianic fervor that's going on, that they could very easily be caught up in this whole let's make him king kind of thing. But he sends them away from the crowd, and then he goes up to the mountainside. Okay, now what happens next? in 16 AD.
The disciples got into a boat and started to cross the sea to Capernaum.
And it's dark by this time, and Jesus isn't with them. Now, I don't want to read too much into that, but this theme of darkness is going to come up several times in John. Nighttime is never a good thing in John. The darkness together with the absence of Jesus doesn't ever bode well, and it's definitely not a good situation for the disciples either. So they make it to somewhere in the middle of the lake, and they end up in this terrible storm. The waters get rough, there's a strong wind, and the darkness plus a storm, plus the absence of Jesus, is pretty serious. So what does Jesus do?
He walks out to them. He said, "It's I." They were afraid, and he said, "Don't be afraid, it is I."
Did you notice he didn't calm the storm first? He just walks out in the middle of it. Or he could have just transported himself to Capernaum and met him on the other side, stopped the storm, and then been there when they got there. Why would he do it this way?
It's a great picture.
Because he wanted to demonstrate that he wanted to take their fear and have them turn it over to him. And he wanted to show that some way that he was the saving power there, or
Yeah. And I love the way John puts it, like it's no big deal. Like they're out there, and then they just see Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, as you do. Like what? It's just crazy. Yeah, like no big deal. It's just nuts. But even though the prophets of the Old Testament did miraculous things, they never did anything like this. For the Israelites, seas and oceans represented disorder and chaos and even evil. And no one could command or control the water, the seas, the oceans, except for God. And the disciples are battling this storm, but when they see Jesus walking toward them on the water, it scares them. Because who could it be? Who could be walking where only God can walk? Well, that's the question, yeah. And I feel that when they're afraid, and the first thing Jesus says is, don't be afraid. And you're like, too late, But Jesus doesn't just say, don't be afraid. He also says, it is I. Now let's talk about that bit. To say it is I, that's a totally appropriate translation in English, but it's actually only 2 words in Greek. So in Greek, what he says is I am. Now, on the surface, that's just Jesus' way of calming the disciples by identifying himself to them. But when you know the larger context and all of the connections to Exodus, to Moses, the wilderness wanderings, the Passover, the bread from heaven, and then when you see Jesus actually walking on the water, it's hard for me not to suspect a double meaning right here. That when he says I am, he really means I am. Why does that matter? Where does that come from?
it comes from God saying, "I am that is."
Yeah, like I am who I... Do you remember who he said that to?
Matthew.
He said to Moses.
Moses.
Yeah.
At the burning bush,
yeah.
when he identified himself to Moses. Oh, we're back to Exodus again. That's very interesting. So, whether the disciples realize it or not, Jesus is the I am. He's not the new Moses. He's the God who called Moses. The same God who rescued the people out of Egypt. He's the one who's just casually walking across the lake in the middle of a storm. I mean, why send the disciples off like that anyway? It's not like Jesus didn't know it was going to get all dodgy for them. But he uses this whole situation to reveal to them and to us that he's more than a prophet, he's more than a revolutionary, he's more than a political messiah. He is the I am in the flesh. And the thing is, it's only the disciples that see it. This isn't the kind of miracle where everybody else is going to understand what happened. They're just going to realize he made it to the other side of the lake without being in a boat. But it's these 12 disciples who get this view of Jesus when he just walks across the lake to the only God.
Oh,
Wow, it's a real party in there, isn't it?
It's 2
Yeah.
boys.
It's amazing how much noise they can make.
I'm not sure what they're doing.
Well, and I think it's interesting that he uses the I, the personal pronoun of I am, and that it's also a personal, like he is a rescuer here, and it's a life kind of. I've heard so many sermons done on about how it's the storm of life and all that, but it's that it's a very personal kind of miracle here, a personal, very intimate kind of appearance that he does, and that they're all of his friends, all of your buddies are in the boat, and they're scared. Okay, they're experiencing fear, and a human emotion right now is fear, and it's not about. It's different than a lot of his other. It's so different. This is different than healing people or bringing back from the dead or feeding or provisions, which also are of the body, but not necessarily emotional. That's what I'm talking about, personal and intimate. Is that he's taking that that what he knows that you feel, like he knows that you feel inside, and he is appearing in his form of love and of like reassurance and blessed, like your comforter, your great friend. That's what I like so much about this, is that.
Well, and he did this miracle for the disciples, which I think is an important sort of aspect of this one, because these are the people who are going to be called upon to spread the gospel later, and they need to have a very firm understanding of who he is. And if he is the God, he's the Alpha, the Omega, he is the Word in the flesh. They need to really understand that on a personal level, and then also later in the fact, like Nanette said, this is a fearful moment for them, and he wants to make it very clear that he is there in those moments, and he's telling them, I am the solution to your fear. Like, I am the one who's going to be in the midst of that for you. I just think that's really important. There's always 1,000 layers to these sort of moments with Jesus. That's amazing.
Another thing was verse 19, it says, so when they had rowed about 5 and 20 or 30 for logs, I have King James Version, but it says that that's equivalent to about 4 miles that they had been rowing. And Jesus was in a body, right? Mm-hmm. So it said that he walked 4 miles on the sea, right? Oh, wow. So he would have walked 4 miles while they're out there.
While the storm's still going.
How long they were struggling with the storm by themselves before the period.
That's a good point.
And another thing about the mountain is, you said Alpha and Omega. I was in a sorority called Alpha Chi Omega, and our motto was Greek, but it said, together let us seek the heights, which also ties into the mountain, kind of. Let us seek the heights. I like that.
Yeah.
That's really nice.
Before we get to the end, I have I'm just wondering, like, the very last verse, 21, and I'm not trying to steal your thunder.
No, go ahead. Steal it.
So we came out 3 to 4 miles, and I had already Googled. The lake's 8 miles wide.
It's like the size of Boyson.
Right, so it's big.
The Sea of Galilee is about the size of Boyson.
And it says, when they say, he says, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they're glad, and they take him into the boat, and immediately they're on shore.
Yep.
So that's kind of like a really fast, quiet miracle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, storm's dead. Now you don't have wind.
Mm-hmm.
It's done, so you should have to row the next 4 miles. But nope, you're done. And you're where you want to go.
And you've met the I am.
And you've met the I am. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like it's just like the quietest little miracle. And immediately, by the way, another little miracle was done.
Let me read for you a little passage from Psalm 107. So this is about people going out to the sea in ships. So it says, some of them went to sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Well, I don't know if they're thinking about any of that, but when you know that kind of stuff is in the Psalms, it's sort of hard not to look at this and think everything Jesus is doing demonstrates that he's God. Both the fact that he can walk across the lake and that he can get them exact. Obviously, the storm is no obstacle once Jesus gets in the boat. like, I don't know how long it took them to get where they were going, but the storm stops being a problem as soon as Jesus arrives.
And we're still going to cycle.
Who's going to
He was
betray him?
with them in the boat, I assume.
Yeah,
And protector.
he's their protector.
What Psalm is that?
Psalm 107. That was verses 23 to 32.
When he's saying I am, is he, like I asked previously, is he trying to just make sure that they understand he's not just a person in the line of David coming to, sit on the Davidic throne and be a political leader? And he's just trying to constantly hammer home this idea that that's not what he is.
Yep. I mean, and it's not just the I am, it's everything he does and everything he says. The miracles he's doing, the way that he's doing them, the teaching that he does, all of that just keeps coming back to this idea he's not just another one in the line of the kings, he's not just another in the line of the prophets, he is in a category all his own. And he breaks all of those categories, and they have to think outside of that stuff to understand who Jesus is. The wineskins of Judaism aren't going to hold the Messiah. He's just too big for that. He's in a completely different category. Yeah. All right, now, this whole section, of course, has a lot of heavy stuff to say about who Jesus is, but all of this is the setup for the teaching that comes next. So remember this when you look at the following bit of the text, because everything Jesus is going to preach about in the rest of chapter 6 is based in these two miracles and what he's going to say about who he is and what his agenda is and why he's come. Okay, any last comments? Anything you want to add? Okay, we'll stop there.